Hello, wa durudu salam, a very warm welcome to all of you who join us for this IIEA webinar. My name is Hassan Hakimian, and it's my distinct pleasure tonight. I say tonight because I'm in Doha. It's early evening. I know everyone joins us from around the world. So depending on wherever you are, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, especially for those in the Middle East, including Iran, of course. As you know, IIEA's webinars run regularly on the second Wednesday of each month. And over the years, we have the honor of actually having a very attractive archive of recordings of these webinars. So do make sure if you have missed any of them, and if you want to check any of them, you visit the IIEA website. The International Iranian Economic Association was established in 2010 as an independent, scholarly, professional, inclusive, and non-political association to connect researchers, policymakers, and anybody interested in research on Iranian economy from anywhere in the world. And we've had many conferences over the years, and as has become rather more practical in the last few years, these have now given way to our monthly webinars. So we have a very hefty topic tonight. And three distinct speakers. And of course, as always, limited by time. So it's my pleasure and challenge to make sure that we do justice to the session, to make sure that this session brings out some of the most interesting, pertinent issues of the economy of the Pahlavi period. The topic today is Pahlavi's Iran, power economy and ritual. And the order of the evening will be as follows. Each speaker will have 20 minutes to make their presentation after a short introduction that I make. And that should give us hopefully about half an hour at the end for our discussions and Q&A from the floor. And I assume that everybody is familiar with Zoom. Therefore, make sure you write in the Q&A section your question for the end. We'll do our best. I'll do my best to ensure that we cover as many of these questions, but again, time may not allow all of those questions to be addressed, so apologies in advance if that is the case regarding your question. I know everyone is here to really hear from our speakers, so allow me to proceed to the session tonight with the order that you can see on the screen. We will have Nicolas Gorjestani, Dr. Nicolas Gorjestani, who will speak on outcomes of authoritarian development on the Pahlavi II. That will be followed by Dr. Nadereh Chamlou, a comparative review of Iran's economy during the Shah's reign. And last but not least, Professor Bianca Devos, who will present on the Shah's pilgrimages to Mecca and Mashhad. So without further ado, let me just say a few brief words about our first speaker. And I'm going to actually, if you don't mind, get rid of the titles and be a little bit more informal. So I'll call you Nicolas and Nadereh and Bianca. I think that's just easier and also saves us time. Right, Nicolas Gorjestani is a former senior official of the World Bank. He was also a special economic advisor to the first president of Georgia. After retiring from the World Bank, he served as executive director of the Global Indigenous Knowledge and Innovation Partnership, an adjunct professor at the Polytechnic University in Hong Kong. Nicolas has authored 2 books, one on Mohammad Mossadegh and the oil negotiations with the World Bank, and another on Georgia's quest for independence. He has also published several articles on Iran's economic issues, including in British Journal of Middle East Studies and Dunyai Iqtisad. So the floor is yours, Nicolas, please.
Thank you very much, Hassan, for your kind introduction. I would like to also thank the IIEA for inviting me to this event. Given the time constraint that you have imposed on us today, I will focus only on one aspect of my paper, namely the development record during the rule of the second Pahlavi and the possible factors that may have contributed to the emergence of revolutionary conditions. The development record of the last Shah of Iran can be divided into three broad phases that I call consolidation from 1953 to 62, reform from 63 to 72, and super ambition from 73 to 79. I will skip the consolidation phase since, as my good friend Homa Kotouzian has observed, quote, until 1960, almost nothing permanent and useful had been achieved and the country was bankrupt. During the reform phase, the Shah's approach to governance and development generally followed his father's authoritarian orientation. The son would say, I don't care what people say. I will do whatever I think is good for the country. The reform program initially included 6 principles, which the Shah had labeled the White Revolution. More principles were added later. Now, 3 of the most important reforms from a developmental perspective were, first, a land reform that redistributed most of the land holdings of landlords to the peasants who possessed the traditional right to till the land, the nasab holders, who represented at that time about 60% of the population. Second, the literacy corps that aimed to bring literacy to the rural areas in a country where about 70% of men and 90% of women over the age of 15 were illiterate. Overall, about 200,000 young boys and girls served in the villages. Thousands of schools were built. About 2 million children and 1 million adults became literate, and the country's illiteracy rate declined to about 44% for men and about 53% for women, an impressive achievement indeed. And finally, there was the women's right to vote. These multifaceted and bold reforms produced eye-catching early results and engendered important structural changes in the Iranian society. Nevertheless, they also had several unintended consequences, including rising expectations. And I'll list a few of them. First, the way the land was distributed excluded more than 1/3 of the rural population known as Khoshneshinaat. As a result, most of this mass of people flocked to the cities and aggravated the rapid growth of urban marginal settlers, Khoshneshinaat. Second, the literacy corps also created new demands, including for more participation in social and political affairs affecting the rural communities. It also radicalized some corpsmen after they saw firsthand the relative poverty and inequality in the rural areas. I had spent 6 months studying the Sepoy Danesh in the early 1970s. Third, although women were very happy indeed to receive the right to vote, their unfulfilled demands for meaningful elections further contributed to the accumulation of societal grievances. And fourth, the reform program was so broad and its implementation speed so rapid that not only it soon exceeded the absorptive capacity of the country's infrastructure and civil institutions, but it also created a culture shock that eventually became the main source of important identity challenges, especially among the growing underprivileged segments of the rapidly growing urban population. In the economic sphere as well, very bold new policies were implemented, which, along with significant new infrastructure projects, helped make Iran's economy grow at a fast pace and become much more dynamic in the 1960s. Hassan, could you please have chart 1 displayed? Thank you very much. Although the rapid increase in oil production was the key driver of economic growth, there was also significant let me see, how do I get out of it to see my notes?
I think this is what happens when we share the screen.
I see. Okay, well, if you can see in the chart, during a period between late 60s, in mid 60s and early 70s, Iran achieved one of the highest growth rates in the world. If you see the red line, that's the line of the 10% growth. So it was one of the most impressive economic growth rates at the time in the world. Can we remove the slide, please? No, just remove the slides completely. And so in a nutshell, with its generally admirable reforms, the Pahlavi regime increased the society's expectations and demands that generally exceeded the system's capacity for readiness to respond. Lack of political development, corruption among the elite, and failure to effectively manage the growing expectations and new societal demands were the most important weaknesses of the development process in this phase. The third phase, the era of super ambition, began with the Shah's meetings with his key advisors in economic conferences in Nadereh and Ramsar in 1973. And it ended with the overthrow of the monarchy in 1979. During discussions about the scope of the prospective Fifth Development Plan, the country's top economic experts warned that the Shah's very ambitious plans were not compatible with the country's absorptive capacity, and that if the current trends of inequality and unbalanced growth continued, the country would witness a social explosion. In response, the Shah declared, and quote, "Again, these economists are talking nonsense. Who told you to write these things?" unquote. In the event, as the price of oil doubled, and despite the warnings of the experts, the Shah doubled the budget of the fifth plan. At the Ramsar conference, Alexandre Mejloumian of the plan organization inserted this prophetic sentence at the end of his report, quote, "This program smells of blood." Unfortunately, the Shah did not listen to the warnings of his advisors and even expelled one of them, Bahman Obadian, from the conference. Obadian quit the plan organization and joined the World Bank, where we were colleagues, and he recounted the story to me. In the event, large oil revenues enabled the implementation of unsustainable expenditures, including a buying spree of the most sophisticated military equipment that eventually led to significant infrastructure bottlenecks, slowdown in economic growth, and rapid inflation. Average real per capita growth dropped to about 0 in the 5 years before the revolution. Meanwhile, with strong growth in liquidity, the inflation rate rose from a very low single-digit trends in 1960s to more than 27% in 1977. Thus, in the 2 years just before the revolution, the cumulative real GDP per capita growth reached about minus 20%, and the cumulative inflation rate reached about plus 40%. The resulting sharp drop in purchasing power had a very negative impact on the standard of living and added to the growing dissatisfaction about the closed political system. Overall, the development record of the last 25 years of monarchy points to several lessons, including some weaknesses and shortcomings that I will enumerate. First, over-reliance on the oil industry as the main driver of economic growth weakened the other sectors of the economy relative to what would have been achieved with a more balanced growth strategy. For example, the share of oil reached more than a third of the GDP in 1979. In other words, about 3 times its share 15 years earlier. In some years, in fact, it had reached near 50%. At the same time, oil accounted for 98% of the total value of Iran's oil export earnings. And moreover, in the last 15 years of the monarchy, the value of oil exports increased 50-fold, while that of non-oil exports increased only fourfold. Second, the industrialization strategy mainly emphasized import substitution without always taking into account the country's comparative advantages. Moreover, an exchange rate that was pegged to the dollar was not an encouragement for exporters of non-oil products. While Iran followed an import substitution strategy, South Korea pursued a strategy of export-driven growth, promoting especially the production of goods for which the country had a comparative advantage, which was cheap labor at that time. In the decade that following the country's shift to an export-oriented strategy, South Korea's per capita output doubled, and the country became a semi-industrialized country. For example, from 60 to 75, the share of industrial production nearly tripled, increasing from under 10% to 27%. Meanwhile, in Iran, and despite more than doubling of its GDP per capita, which was driven mainly by expansion in oil production, the structure of the economy had not experienced a major transformation towards extensive industrialization. For example, in Iran, just before the revolution, the total production of industrial sectors, apart from oil and construction, was only about 12% of GDP, roughly the same as 15 years earlier. Third, in Iran, large investments were made mostly in capital-intensive production and less in labor-intensive operations. For example, the cost of creating a job in modern manufacturing ranged between $4,000 in 1960s and $20,000 in the 1970s. In other words, 8 or 12 times the per capita income. Most importantly, from a political economy perspective, this strategy failed to create sufficient number of stable, good factory jobs to absorb the masses that had flocked to the urban areas. For example, in 1976, the emerging modern industrial manufacturing subsector employed only about 150,000 people, or about 6% of the total labor force in the industrial sector. This phenomenon, together with the sudden drop in oil income between 74 and 76, and the reduction in public spending to curb inflation, caused widespread unemployment in the urban areas. In the event, the mass of people that had migrated from the rural areas to the urban outskirts turned into the so-called infantry of the revolution. Fourth, the urban bias development strategy and neglect of citizens' participations, in particular in the development process, led to inequitable development between the center and the periphery. And an important consequence of this strategy was to perpetuate severe inequalities in access to public services. 3 examples are telling in this regard. First, in the years just before the revolution, while about 80% of the urban population had access to clean water, only about 10% of the rural population received such services. Second, in 1973, only about 3% of the university students were from the urban working class and rural classes, while these social groups constituted more than 80% of the country's population. Finally, it was estimated that more than half of the total population and nearly 2/3 of the urban population was malnourished. The fifth issue that contributed to the accumulation of dissatisfactions was the huge military expenditure program, together with Savak's repressive activities, as well as the lack of progress in political development. Finally, although the Shah's authoritarian approach to development had led to significant results in the short term, it could not in the medium term effectively manage the challenges of sustainable and inclusive development, as well as the unintended consequences of the important reforms that had been undertaken under his rule. With this, I would like now to conclude with a few observations that generally don't make it into economic analyses, the socio-psychological dimension of the problem. See, the social changes that the Shah's bold reforms brought about had a profound effect on the people's value systems. In 1974, a national survey was carried out, and its findings were later published as a book under the very suggestive title, صدایی که شنیده نشد, the voice that was not heard. The key findings were, one, most people were torn away from their familiar environment and were struggling to find a place in the new one. Two, the magnitude and speed of change was transforming Iran's socio-psychological foundation, while most of the people were not ready or equipped to handle the transition. And finally, many, especially the underprivileged urban residents, were experiencing a severe identity crisis. These developments were the main motivation behind the new cultural phenomenon of that time. بازگشت به گذشته, return to the past, the بازگشت به خویشتن, return to self, that was reflected in various ways in the literature and the movies of that era. If you have seen Qaysar, you will see what I mean. Meanwhile, the people's religious identity became an isomorphic space that would connect life's material values with spiritual values and relieve the person from the prevailing contradictions in the opposing value systems. For example, that same study revealed that young generation of that era had a special affinity towards religious values. Now, if you would do that survey today, I guarantee you, you're going to get the opposite results. Thus, on the surface, the country was modernizing. However, important segments of the society could not absorb such extensive, rapid, and unbalanced change that had shaken the foundations of their cultural and social identity. The internal conflict between the modern and traditional identities could be seen even in the royal court, a space where one dimension tended towards modernity, like, for example, the Center for Children's Intellectual Development and the Shiraz Art Festival. And the other dimension was oriented towards traditional values and returning to self, for example, the philosophy and the activism of Sayyid Hossein Nasr, the Farhadi Boss chief of staff. Under the circumstances, although the political opposition, including the National Front, the leftists, and the religious factions, differed in their analyses of the country's challenges, they eventually united broadly around a narrative with the proposition that solving the society's accumulated problems will only be possible if the ruling regime were transformed or replaced. In this context, the Shah eventually lost the battle of ideas, and the religious factions were relatively more successful than the others in promoting their narrative, largely due to their relatively more effective organizational network of mosques, Hosseiniers, etc. These had grown exponentially and ironically, in part due to government support. The political strength of the religious network grew largely due to the regime's strategy of repressing the other opposition forces. In fact, by repressing the moderate and secular political formations, the regime de facto removed from the scene the main political rivals of the religious factions. In the event, the religious factions became the dominant presence in the on the political scene, and were better able to reach the relatively traditional segments of the population, especially the millions hovering around the bazaars and the urban slums. Overall, a combination of factors, including the Shah's political strategic mistakes, the paralysis of decision-making within the ruling circles in the last few years, the deprivation of political freedoms, the suppression of the secular moderate opposition, and the inability of the political system to respond to the people's growing demands for voice and inclusion gradually revolutionized the social scene. In fact, it can be plausibly argued that the Shah himself was de facto the so-called founder of the revolution. Despite implementing significant economic and social reforms and creating new institutions, the Shah's arbitrary rule generally emptied those institutions of their democratic identity by creating pseudo-parties, conducting show elections, and suppressing dissent. The regime prevented citizens from meaningfully participating in the country's affairs. As a result, the voice of the people could no longer reach the Shah's ears. Ultimately, however, it was the citizens of Iran who did not hear or did not want to hear the Shah's voice when he declared in November of '78, quote, "I heard the voice of your revolution." 6 days before leaving Iran to never return, and as the monarchy was collapsing under the weight of its internal contradictions, the Shah received Houshang Nahavandi, the Minister of Science, and said to him, quote, "Do you see this head?" pointing to his head. "It no longer works. Let me go. I want to go. The army can do whatever hell it wants. I can't do anything anymore," unquote. With this, I invite the audience to study my paper, since due to the time constraint, I could not address many more arguments and details, including answers to two very important questions. Why did the revolution succeed, and why did it become Islamic? The paper is available on the IIEA website. Thank you very much for your attention. And Hassan, did I stay within my time?
You exceeded by 20 seconds. That's admirable. In fact, I don't know if you could hear, my alarm went off.
I see.
Yeah, but anyway, that's a challenging task I have tonight because we have very rich presentations. As I said, a very engaging topic. And of course, there's a lot more that can be said, but I appreciate all speakers doing their best to stay within the time limit. And I don't want to harass you, but I trust your timekeeping as well. So let me very briefly also introduce Nadereh, who's well known within the IIEA realm because she's also a board member, a former senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and former senior advisor of the World Bank, where over a 33-year career, she held managerial, technical, coordination, and advisory positions across different regions and in diverse fields, such as economic management, corporate governance, private sector development, financial markets, environment, infrastructure, and gender. She has authored seminal publications, which were translated into French, Arabic, and Spanish. She's a frequent speaker at international conferences and serves on boards of organizations promoting research, empowerment, and innovation. Educated at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and Graduate School for Economics, she was also the recipient of the International Alliance for Women's 2015 Making a Difference Global Award. So over to you, Nadereh. And you have 20 minutes as well.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Hassan, for your generous introduction. And thank you, Nicolas, for your paper. Well, my perspective is slightly different, particularly because I'm a woman, and I think that during the reign of both Pahlavis, Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah, the one thing that really changed was to allow people like myself to participate. And I think if it hadn't been for them, I wouldn't be sitting here in front of you today and had the honor to present what I think. So let me share my presentation. Let me see, where is my share here? Okay. All right. Let me do this. So what I'm doing here, can you see it? Okay. So what I'm doing here is a comparative review of Iran's economic development from 1941 to 1978. And I have to tell you that the motivation for this was that when Biden lost the presidency in November 24, it's sort of like, to me, it seemed like this is a scenario that I have seen. Biden took office amid a global pandemic. He took measures to stimulate, redirect the U.S. economy. Experts argued that his American Rescue Plan, which was really targeted for pandemic issues, was too large and it caused inflation. He achieved market results, as you can see from the cover of The Economist, much better than any other, advanced economy. Yet Trump tapped into economic and cultural anxieties, urban-rural inequalities in the United States, and particularly the support of religious evangelicals. Biden left office very, very heartbroken, and the Democrats still blame him for the defeat. Trump has come in and aggressively reversed almost every single act that Biden had, and more importantly, he has gone very strongly against the woke issues, which is gender and diversity and so on and so forth. So the whole thing kind of reminded me quite a bit of a scenario that I had seen before, and I saw similarities between Biden and the Shah. So the purpose of my review, which is a work in progress, and it will be published later this year, was to kind of add to that soul searching as to what exactly caused the Iranian revolution. But at the same time, what I want to focus on is on how Iran compared vis-a-vis the global environment, because, you know, we are very often focusing only on Iran, whereas disregarding what was happening in the rest of the world, and also compared to some of Iran's comparators. And I will get into that in a little while. So I think that the topics that I looked at was power, prosperity, and welfare, and power in terms of Iran's economic footprint, prosperity in terms of rise of per capita income, and welfare in terms of reducing inequality. Why do I want to compare Iran versus others? In order to see whether alternative policy paths would have probably resulted in different outcomes, at least economic outcomes. And did geopolitics play a role? Did, you know, oil versus, you know, export versus, you know, import orientation play a role? And also, would governance models play a role in the outcome of in economic outcomes at the end of the 1970s? The countries that I'm looking at are two countries that are close by, Turkey and Egypt, oil producers, Mexico and Venezuela, and East Asian tiger, South Korea and Thailand. Other than Venezuela, I have worked on all the other countries among many other middle-income countries that I have worked in during my tenure at the World Bank. The issues that I looked at was oil dependency, state-led industrialization, and I will not go into the details of this and other tables for the sake of time. Did they have authoritarian governance, like, you know, what Nicolas was referring to? Was there inequality, urban rural inequality common across all of them? Cold War pressures across all of them, and outcomes in the late 1970s, early 80s, so that I will look at this. The sources that I use are World Bank archives. I essentially looked at the very first report that the World Bank produced for these countries, periodic reports in between, and also the last report that came that was produced during that period, including for Iran. I looked at global economic circumstances. I looked at quantitative methods, World Bank development indicators, Madison Project database, which has kind of provided an interesting expansion of economic data way into, you know, what is available on the World Bank development indicators, World Inequality Database, and many other issues. The methodology, essentially what I'm doing is a comparative historical analysis. I will not get into this. People can read about it. Now, I want to talk about my conclusions first and then get into just in case I don't have enough time for the conclusion. Anyway, what is the Shah's economic legacy? I think he inherited a destitute country that deteriorated further over the following 15 years. He revived the economy phenomenally between 1957, when the World Bank gave its very first loan, 12 years after Iran had become a member. The oil windfall was a double-edged sword, as Nicolas already talked about it. 25-year economic political stability was something between 1953 to 1979 that Iranians benefited from. Most importantly, he prevented Iran from becoming a communist party. And also, we don't know what the Shah's plans may have achieved because it was truncated. Many of the GCC countries have followed the Shah's essentially development models, And we see today that they have had great success. So I will get into the assessment of erstwhile opponents of the Shah if we have time, but by and large, this is what I would like to do. I would like to go through phases of the Shah's reign and the dominant development thinking over time. Nicolas mentioned that the Shah had taken this import substitution thing, but I want to say that this was that Iran in general followed very much what was the evolving development theory, development paradigm of the period of those periods, Iran versus the peers. And then I want to talk about the global economy in late 1970s, which had a very, very severe impact on all countries, advanced and developing countries. And then I will summarize again my takeaways. So he comes to the throne very suddenly at the age of 21 during the occupation by all by Allied forces during World War II, 1941 to 45. After the war, immediately after the war, we have the Azerbaijan crisis of 1946 to 47. Again, everything is at standstill because nobody knows what's going to happen. It is followed, the Azerbaijan crisis is followed by a 2-year very severe drought, and then another 2 years of very, very bad business recession. So again, and all throughout this period, there are unstable governments. One prime minister comes, another one goes. All of them, all of them essentially impeached by the parliament, not dismissed by the Shah. I have to add to that. Then comes the oil nationalization, the Mossadegh era, political polarization thereafter, and so on. Then we have the resolution of the crisis and the restart of the economy onward. We have the White Revolution, political unrest. I will get into that a little bit further. Then we have the oil price increase, windfall. And of course, 1978, we have the unrest leading to the revolution. Now, the early years, I have to say that with the very early years during the period of the World War years, the Shah did two important things. One is that even though the Tehran conference was about how to end the war, the Shah met with all of the leaders, Stalin, Churchill, and Roosevelt, and made sure that in the Tehran communique, two important factors would be included. One was Iran's territorial integrity, which helped Iran afterwards to get the Soviets out of Iran. And the second thing is the promise of aid for reconstruction of Iran. So there was a recognition that Iran's really rudimentary infrastructure had been depleted during the war. And the second thing that the Shah did is that when the Bretton Woods conference took place, he sent a very, very capable delegation headed by Mr. Ebtehaj, so that Iran was really at the forefront. And Iran and Mr. Ebtehaj had a very important, when you read Keynes's book and all the other Bretton Woods documentation, he did have an impact on the formulation of Bretton Woods. And Iran becomes one of its earliest signatories and has a fairly, relatively fairly high subscribed capital. Iran asks for a very early loan of $250 million to really, do everything. But the problem was that Iran was not able to prepare the loans. Back then, the World Bank didn't really appraise the loans specifically. They would take, it's a long story, which I will not get into. Anyway, it took 12 years for the bank to get its very first loan, and I will get into that in a little while. So this is the early economic assessment of Iran, which has implications for what Iran could do, whether it could do import substitution, export and promotion, oil economy, and so on. And as you can see, I don't know how I can get rid of my the pictures here. Let me just, because I cannot see my, okay. Let me go by phone. Oops, here. It says Iran, this is the earliest assessment of the World Bank. It says Iran is an economy with an oil economy superimposed on a primitive and almost biblical economy, in desperate need of economic development. Eventual absorption of the country into the Soviet sphere is a probability, ripe for communism. Limited number of Persians with experience and qualifications necessary to handle the administrative and supervisory problems of a program of the sort contemplated. No external and internal debt, limitations of internal finance. In other words, Iran didn't have the internal counterpart funds to have the project. Internal finance constitute important difficulty. So this is I got from the Turkey report. This shows where Iran's per capita income stood in comparison to its neighbors in the late 1940s. As you can see, Iran is considerably lower than Turkey, Lebanon, Egypt, and so on. Now I will skip to that. So finally, there is a lot of push by the US to really do something. And out of the 250 million program that Iran's proposed, 3 projects were kind of proposed for lending for about $3 million. And the World Bank sends out a creditworthiness mission. And the creditworthiness mission comes back essentially confirming what I read to you before. And it says that Iran cannot be considered creditworthy. This is before the oil nationalization, cannot be considered creditworthy from the point of view of capacity to pay. So Iran in 1950, this is the report was issued in 1950, and it was declassified recently. So then the nationalization happens and Iran is in destitute. Well, just to give you an example, the Iranian currency depreciated from 2.7 to 1 to 11.1, which was an 82% per year devaluation in those period during the Mossadegh year. If we compare it to today, I mean, the Shah left in January of 1979, and the depreciation since 1979 up to today is 23%. And to add to it, Walter Levy, who was an oil expert, demonstrated, or at least had presented a very extensive report that Iran during that period of oil nationalization, or the Mossadegh era, lost about $450 million in government income and about $600 million in foreign exchange. So on top of the war and all of the problems that came, in 1954, Iran was a terrible, terrible basket case. Excuse me. Now, I have here, it's important to think a little bit about what did the global thinkers think about how to proceed. So in late 1940s, all the attention was on post-war reconstruction. In the 1950s, it shifted to, with Walter Rostov's idea, shifted to modernization theory. Then in the 1960s, it was structuralism, and it was only in 1970 that the basic needs approach came up. I have to say that when the oil windfalls came, there was no theory around to help governments how to deal with it. Yes, I agree very much that the Shah should have listened to his advisors, but what I want to say is that there was no global thinking. Even the topic of the Dutch disease didn't appear until late 1977. So, and then of course in the 1990s, it was a Washington consensus, and it was of course from 2000s onwards is the MDGs and the SDGs. So the development focus of the World Bank and of the world has changed and evolved, partly because of problems that appeared with one theory versus the other. Here is a timeline of the theories. I will not go through it. Now, what shaped the Shah's development thinking? First of all, these development models. Then he had, of course, these Harvard economic advisors that were coming in. The Shah had, of course, the World Bank and the IMF. He had a cadre of well-educated Iranian technocrats who had been trained at the leading institutions. He traveled very extensively. He talked with world leaders, state visits. He did all of those. He had, of course, geopolitical considerations. And of course, he had a strong desire for an industrial Iran. And he filtered all of this into this advice, not that he followed them all, but nonetheless, this is how it appeared. Now, I have also to say that over this period of 1950 to 1970, Iran obtained 33 loans from the World Bank in comparison to some of the countries that I mentioned who benefited much more from the World Bank financing. Now, let me compare it with the peers. Again, it's the power, prosperity, and welfare. Here is in Iran's power, economic footprint, the economic footprint as percentage of global GDP. As you can see, Iran and all of its peers, other than Venezuela, essentially started around the same place. And Iran's share in 1950 was about 0.5%. It almost tripled it by the time of the revolution, and then it is now down. 46 years late, or whatever, 40 years later, it is down to 0.9%. In terms of prosperity, GDP per capita, again, all of these countries were basically around the same area in 1950. Iran, as you can see, is the orange line, has outpaced all of the other ones by the time of the revolution, and then it very huge decline, and now only slowly is getting back in real terms. And in terms of the Gini coefficient, according to the World Inequality Index, this is all of these countries had very, very bad inequalities across the board. And as you can see, between 1959 and 1974, inequality in Iran steadily decreased, whereas in some of the other countries, Turkey and all of these other comparators, it actually increased quite a bit. So what happened in late 70s? Late 70s was a period of severe turbulences and transition, which affected every country. The oil shocks, high inflation, the breakdown of the Bretton Woods system, monetary tightening, and so on and so forth, affected every country. And this is the global inflation, as you can see during that period, that it went high very much. Here I graphed, sort of like essentially global average inflations and what Iran's US inflation was and what Iran's inflation was. But let me go here. This is again, how Iran and US fared. And here is the inflation rate for all of the different Iran's different comparators. In 1979, the year of the revolution, it was 25%. Turkey was 63%. So the inflation issue affected inflation affected every country, be it oil.
Sorry, Nadereh, my timer's gone off 20
minutes. I'm finishing with
sure.
two more.
If you can round up, please. Yeah, sure.
Just wanted to say that the other countries also ran into severe economic problems. This is what Turkey and all of these other countries went through. South Korea and Thailand barely went through it, but the 4 out of the 6 got how should I say, IMF assistance. And here's my conclusion. It's basically that overall, the Shah left Iran much better than he had inherited it, particularly in comparison to Iran's peers. And we don't know what would have happened if the Shah's programs had continued. We can see it on the basis of what the GCC countries are doing, how they have developed, because they essentially copied the Shah's programs. And certainly when we compare the Shah's track record to the past 46 years of when the opposition to the Shah took over, we see that it is quite remarkable. And with this, I thank you very much, and I will stop.
Great, thank you very much. Well, these two first presentations have been very rich with ideas, with arguments, with data, and there's a lot to ponder over. Do make sure you put your questions in the Q&A, and I hope we will have time to address some of them, as I said earlier on. The next speaker, Bianca Devos, will introduce a welcome change. She will take us back through a visual tour of our recent history and add some very interesting pictures and images from Iranian media on a topic which is, quite interesting and understudied. So let me say, Bianca Devos is a professor of Iranian studies at the Center for Near and Middle Eastern Studies at Philipps Universität Marburg in Germany. Her research focuses on the cultural history of modern Iran. Her publications include books and articles on the press and entrepreneurship in early Pahlavi Iran, the representation of Persepolis in the print media, the adoption of new technologies in early 20th century Iran, and Reza Shah's dress politics. Together with Christoph Werner, she co-edited the volume that was published by Routledge in 2014. It has a long title, I read it: Culture and Cultural Politics under Reza Shah, the Pahlavi State, New Bourgeoisie, and the Creation of a Modern Society in Iran. Okay, over to you, Bianca. And I believe you have your presentation to share.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hassan, for this kind introduction. I think you can see my presentation, right?
Yes.
Yes, all fine. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Photographs of Mohammad Reza Shah at the tomb of the Achaemenid King Cyrus as part of the pompous celebrations of the 2500th anniversary of the Iranian monarchy in 1971 became a symbol of nationalism in the Pahlavi state, emphasizing the country's pre-Islamic past and promoting a westernized modernism. Another example is this photograph. We see the Shah dancing with Betty Ford, wife of the President of the United States. In stark contrast to these secularized forms of royal representations, photographs of the Shah in Mecca show him in pilgrim's garb, performing his religious duty as a Muslim. The divergent representations of the Shah underscore the inherent tension between the religion and secularism within the official nationalism of the Pahlavi state, while attempting to resolve this tension in various ways. The Pahlavi state adopted an ambivalent attitude towards Islam. On the one hand, it sought to suppress religious views that conflicted with modernization, as well as political opposition that legitimized itself through religion. And on the other hand, Shia Islam was promoted for nationalist reasons because of its continuing importance in culture and society. And even though the anti-religious attitude of the Pahlavi state became virtually a paradigm in the historiography, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 was often or is often perceived as a reaction to the secular nationalism of an authoritarian ruler and his elite, alienated from the people and their religious feelings, the Pahlavi state did not pursue a rigorously secular policy, but rather propagated its own interpretation of Islam as a kind of state Islam, we can say, and even initiated a kind of religious renaissance in the 1970s. And as part of this policy, the Shah was officially presented as a practicing Muslim. And my presentation examines the Shah's pilgrimages to Mecca and Mashhad, not with a focus on Mohammad Reza Pahlavi's personal piety, but on its representation as a Muslim or as a Muslim ruler in the Iranian press. A quick note on the press first. The press of the late Pahlavi period, like other mass media and publishing, was subject to strict state censorship. In addition, there was an intense self-censorship by journalists. The editors of the two major newspapers dominating Iran's press market at the time, Etellaat and Kayhan, belonged to the circle of the Pahlavi elite close to the court. And this means that the Iranian press was state-directed, that newspaper content was very likely officially approved, or at any rate did not contradict official guidelines. With Mohammad Reza Shah's pilgrimages to Mecca, which were part of his state visits to Saudi Arabia, we have a sensitive topic in several regards. The visits were of great diplomatic importance, and the Shah was the main protagonist. So we can assume a particularly watchful eye of the senses on such a sensitive topic. So first, I would like to examine the press coverage of Mohammad Reza Shah's trip to Saudi Arabia, during which he made the pilgrimage to Mecca. And after that, I will take a brief comparative look at the press coverage of his visits to Mashhad, where he made a ziyarat to the shrine of the 8th Imam of the 12th Shia, Imam Reza. And my focus will not be on how the Shah was portrayed when performing religious rituals and how his pilgrimages were contextualized in the newspaper. Mohammad Reza Shah's pilgrimages to Mecca have hardly been noticed so far. We discovered, at least in infotainment programs of Persian language TV channels outside Iran, such as Manoto. And the Shah undertook several journeys to Saudi Arabia, and here I would like to consider the reports on 2 journeys during which the Shah undertook an Umrah, which is a small pilgrimage which can be carried out at any time. That means outside the pilgrimage month. In March 1957 and November 1968, the Shah made pilgrimages to Mecca during his 6-day stay in Saudi Arabia. And if we look at the Iranian press coverage of the Shah's trips and his pilgrimages to Mecca, one motive is predominant. The Saudi hosts great reverence for the Shah. We have minute descriptions of the official reception at the airport. They were followed by reports of cheering crowds along the streets, festive receptions in the palaces of the Saudi royal family, and detailed enumerations of the high dignitaries paying their respects to the Iranian monarch. And this motive runs repetitively through all articles. The key message behind all this, of course, is that the Iranian Shah was adequately received as a respected ruler and that relations between the 2 countries were good and friendly. While in 1957, the Iranian journalists were still pointing out that the relations had only recently intensified, by 1968, they were already reporting, as a matter of course, on the talks between King Faisal and Mohammad Reza Shah as negotiations between 2 leading regional powers. The dominant topic in 1968 was the impending withdrawal of the British from the Persian Gulf. Since oil revenues accounted for 38% of Iran's national budget in 1968, the stability of the Persian Gulf was essential, and that was a secure sea route for Iranian oil exports through the Strait of Hormuz. And due to the coverage of the Shah's visits to Saudi Arabia, the topic of Islam was much more present than usual in the newspapers, especially in the 1950s. We have the Iranian press give very little space to the subject of Islam. The articles remarkably often refer to Iran as a Muslim country, Mamlekat Musalman Iran, and call for more cooperation between Islamic nations. They invoke the spirit of brotherhood and the unity of Islam, Ittihad Islam, after centuries of disunity in order to gain strength in world politics. Here, however, Muslim unity should not be understood as the utopia of an all-Islamic unification, as, for example, in the early centuries of Islam. Instead, Islam emerges as the unifying element between the 2 countries of Saudi Arabia and Iran, thus assuming a demarcation function vis-à-vis the Arab states that were on the opposite side during the Cold War. First of all, vis-à-vis Egypt, and from 1958 on, also Iraq. These countries had opposed the Baghdad Pact of 1955 and accepted Soviet patronage instead. And their pan-Arab and socialist orientation was thus countered by a pan-Islamic rhetoric in the Iranian newspapers, which also used the vocabulary of progress and showed a leaning toward Western modernism. For instance, in 1957, the author of this article hopes that the Shah's journey will serve the progress of Islamic society, Pishrafte Jami'e Islam. And the motive of progress can be found very clearly in the reports on the 1957 trip, especially with the connotation of technological progress. A particularly striking example is the repeated reference to the fact that the Shah himself flew the plane for a while on the flight from Tehran to Riyadh. And the picture shows the Shah, a passionate pilot, in the cockpit while flying over the Iraqi mountains. So Iran participated in the global modernization debate of the post-war period. in which the airplane as a symbol of technical progress assumes metaphorical significance for the advancement of society. And it is not particularly surprising that the official modernism of the Pahlavi state is the frame of reference in the state-controlled press, even when reporting on the pilgrimages. We can see here that the Islamic pilgrimage does not appear as a ritual of a backward religiosity, but the pilgrimage was embedded in the state's concept of modern Iranian society. The Iranian press portrays the Shah as a modern Iranian ruler whose role as a pilot appears equal and without contradiction to his role as a pilgrim during this journey. And not only the texts of the newspapers were controlled by the state censorship, but also the images. And here the censors were particularly sensitive, as research on press history has shown. Even though I cannot present a conclusive image analysis here, I would like to give an insight into how the photos were used to illustrate the newspaper articles, which also influences the perception of content, of course, and images are therefore never purely documentary. As the picture of the Flying Shah shows, state modernism is reflected in Iranian press photos. Modernity manifests itself in the Queen. Pahlavi appears several times in the pictures of the 1968 trip. At this time, 5 years after the White Revolution, already stylized as the ideal of the modern Iranian woman. In this picture, she receives her husband on arrival from Saudi Arabia. Another aspect of the coverage can be illustrated by the pictures, especially from 1968. The overall impression is that on his trips to Saudi Arabia, the Shah is portrayed first and foremost as a statesman and not as a pilgrim. In only 2 of a total of 9 pictures in 1968, the Shah can be seen visiting the holy sites, once praying in a suit in the Prophet's Mosque in Medina, and once making the pilgrimage to Mecca, and that is the only picture which shows him in pilgrim garb. The caption puts the photograph in the context of the state visit by emphasizing that the Shah, after performing the Umrah, went to the interior of the Kaaba, which was only opened once a year when the Saudi king cleaned the room with Iranian rose water. And as a special tribute to the Shah, King Faisal now had the Kaaba opened a second time. And this clearly shows how the Iranian press pushed the religious significance of the Shah's pilgrimage into the background. The focus is not on the performance of the pilgrimage rituals or the religious act, but rather on the gesture of friendship made by the Saudi king during the state visit. And when we look at the pictures in the coverage of the 1957 trip, we have more pictures showing the Shah and his companions performing the pilgrimage rituals. There are 4 pictures in total. One is shows the Iranian group in pilgrimage garb just before they begin the tawaf, the circumambulation of the Kaaba. And another group picture, and below it a picture of the prominent member of the delegation, Said Hassan Tarizadeh. And we have another picture which shows members of the group drinking from the Zamzam fountain. And the Shah can only see here from behind. We can thus note that despite the larger number of pictures showing the performance of pilgrimage rituals in 1957, the Shah again does not occupy a prominent position, quite in contrast to the photographs showing him meeting with the Saudi king, as can be seen. Oh, yeah, I think on the same page on the bottom right, yeah, you can see it here. So we can conclude that in the coverage of the visits to Saudi Arabia, the Shah is presented as the head of a self-confident Islamic state whose understanding of religion is compatible with modernity. And the aspect of his own being a Muslim is clearly subordinate to his function as a statesman. By refraining from the depiction of the religious rituals, the press did not exploit the iconographic potential of these pilgrimages, even though explicit photographs from the Shah's pilgrimage exist, such as this picture from the Iranian National Archives in Tehran. And this close-up from 1968 explicitly shows the Shah performing a special pilgrimage ritual. He bends down to the black stone embedded in the Kaaba, which is of course of central importance in the sanctuary in Mecca. And interestingly, newspapers printed a similar picture, but not of the Shah, but of his brother, Ghulam Reza Pahlavi, when he performed the pilgrimage to Mecca in another year. As I assume that the press reports correspond to the image of the Shah as a Muslim, which the Pahlavi state intended to promote, it is relevant to also to consider what cannot be found in the articles and to look at what has been left out. And one such omission is particularly striking. In all articles, the confessional difference between Saudi Arabia and Iran is omitted. The conflicting religious beliefs of the Saudi and Iranian population are not mentioned at all. The Iranian journalists even avoid using terms like Wahhabiyya, Wahhabi, or Shia, Shiite. Instead, they spoke about Islam in general terms. And while propagating the new unity between the two Muslim countries, they remained silent about historical conflicts. Think of the destruction of the tombs of the Shiite imams in Iraq and Saudi Arabia by the Wahhabis, because they strictly reject any veneration of saints and prohibit pilgrimages to the tombs of saints. But these pilgrimages, the so-called ziyarat, are an important part of Shiite religious practice and make the tomb of the 8th Imam of the 12th Shia, Imam Reza, in Mashhad, the most important pilgrimage center within Iran. Mohammad Reza Shah paid a regular, and that means an annual, visit to the shrine. And I would also like to take a quick look at the coverage of his travels to Mashhad and his ziyarat. Shrine pilgrimages have per se a different character than a pilgrimage to Mecca. Already under the Pahlavis, the Hajj to Mecca was completely state-controlled, with fixed quotas of pilgrims regulated by the Ministry of Endowments. In contrast, shrine pilgrimages were organized by local community organizations and were therefore totally local enterprises. And accordingly, the Shah's visit to the shrine in Mashhad was a local, a national affair, not a foreign trip with diplomatic implications. And the fact that ministers often traveled with him also contributed to the domestic political character of these trips. This is clearly reflected in the coverage. Reports on the Shah's ziyarat were always embedded in articles that focused on other issues, mostly current issues. So in these articles, the national element comes to the fore and domestic issues were discussed. The articles often portrayed the Shah inspecting the situation of the shrine, or more generally, the province of Khorasan. He asked, for example, whether his directives have been implemented, whether workers of Khorasan's factories owned by the Osrane Quds, the Shrine Foundation, had received their promised shares, whether housing projects or hospital projects had been advanced, and so on. The Shah appears in the role of the caring ruler of the nation, fulfilling his constitutionally defined role as a protector and promoter of 12 Shia and as head of the shrine. In comparison to the Mecca pilgrimage, a nationally specific religion dimension is relevant here. While a pilgrimage to Mecca is an undisputed part of a Muslim's basic duties, the position of Shiite Orthodox ulama towards the ziyarat is certainly ambivalent. As an essential part of Shiite popular belief, the ziyarat is connected with asking a saint to intercede for believers, shafa'at, and some members of the Orthodox clergy disapprove this. So the visits to Mashhad, they explicitly include this element of popular Islam practiced by the ruler. For example, when Nowruz and Muharram coincided in the year 1971, Mohammad Reza Shah attended during his state visit the Ashura ceremonies of the people in Mashhad. And this performance of popular Shiite rituals by the Shah were explicitly reported also in the newspaper. And with that, I would like to conclude. The Shah, as a Muslim, performing pilgrimages and other religious practices had been explicitly portrayed in Iranian newspapers in a neutral or in a positive way. And Islam as practiced by the ruler appears as compatible with modernity and also as an important part of Iranian identity. But the pilgrimages appear subordinate to other facets of his rule. They are always presented in the context of other aspects and topics. In Mecca, Mohammad Reza Shah is the statesman on a diplomatic mission, the head of an Islamic state with regional power ambitions. And in Mashhad, he's the popular, caring ruler, fulfilling his constitutional duties and checking whether the reform program initiated by the state has been adequately implemented. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. That was 19 seconds, less than 20 minutes.
Oh, great.
Even more admirable. Thank you very much. I mean, this was obviously a very different perspective on the same period, although you did touch, I believe, on some common themes and elements that were touched by our previous speakers, especially Nicolas, modernism and traditionalism, religion and culture, but in a different and rather interesting way. For those of us who were brought up in Iran, of course, this was, this brought back memories. I must admit, I couldn't help being distracted reading other titles on the newspaper pages you were showing, because there were some other very interesting topics. I assume the fact that just a quick one for you, we do have some questions in the Q&A section, which I will address in a second. And in fact, I will ask Kamyar to give the audio, to activate the audio so that colleagues can ask their questions in person. The reason, I mean, those of us who remember those years, 50s, 60s, 70s, of course, the Shah traveled a lot. And usually his travels were covered actively with a lot of pomp and ceremony, including in media. The reason why you chose these two particular trips, is this to do with the belief that religion was, a very important factor throughout these years, despite the modernism and growth and expansion of the economy?
So the reason why I chose these two trips to Saudi Arabia, these were the trips he undertook the Umrah. He made a pilgrimage. In other trips, he did not perform the pilgrimage. So it was these two.
But he went to other countries. He visited many other countries.
Yes. Yeah. It was just the central importance of the of visiting Mecca that caught my interest. And but we also have pictures when he went to I think Morocco. We see him praying. Also, we have other countries and seeing him performing religious duties. But I think a pilgrimage to Mecca, that's exceptional, and so that is also reflected in the coverage, I think.
So could we say the takeaway from your presentation is that even his allusion to religiosity didn't ultimately save him? Is that what we can conclude? Or am I putting words into your mouth?
Maybe, yeah, a little bit.
Okay.
Right. My intention was to show that that we have religion as one facet of in the Pahlavi state politics, and that played a role in domestic politics, which is a very wide field, but also in foreign politics. It served as for me, an interesting tool to maybe promote regional power ambitions here.
Sure. And you could argue ultimately his own downfall as well. Anyhow, let's move on. We have a few questions in the Q&A. Some of these are directly addressed to Nicolas, but I would like to give everyone who feels like they have something to say to address them. Nima Bakhtiari asks, thank you for Nicolas' analysis. It was very helpful. What key strategies and models can Iranians adopt to reverse the current situation? So this is really looking at that period from today's perspective, from the post-revolution, putting on post-revolution lenses. Briefly, I think this does relate to both Nicolas and if Nadereh also wants to make one or two comments briefly, and then we will go on to the other questions. Go ahead, please, Nicolas.
Okay. Yeah, it's an excellent question. In fact, I have an article in the Dunya Iqtisad precisely on that topic. If I would just summarize three main policies to follow based on the previous experience, that number one, move away from oil towards a knowledge-based economy, because there is this pent-up creativity in the Iranian society, particularly among the younger generation, that is just hungry for startups to create the knowledge-based activities. And the problem is that Iran is close to the global economy. So the next important thing is to join the world economy, and it has several steps that needs to be undertaken. And third, more internally, is to remove the barriers to entry, particularly for women. You see, Iran today, women represent 15% of the workforce. Now, there is a massive potential that is underutilized in Iran. And part of it is all these discriminatory policies. You know, there are at least 20 gender-specific restrictions in the Iranian legal code for entry into to get a job, to start a business that applies to women. So that is an important thing. And the other one is just generally barriers to entry. It takes something around 50 to 75 days and 6 specific hoops that you have to go through in order to register a business. Now, I know another country neighboring to Iran, Georgia, where they managed to create a system where you can do in one step and in one day start a business. Now, if some of these simple, really simple things, politically difficult, but structurally simple, it can do a lot to sort of open up this potential of creativity that is really sitting up there. And final point is that by doing this, you can also increase the participation generally, not only of women, but men. Iranian society today has a 40% labor participation rate. Neighboring Turkey is 60%. That means equivalent of 15 million new jobs that could be created if Iran brought itself to the level of those comparatives. I hope that answers the question.
Great. Well, this is obviously a very big topic, and we could devote a couple of webinars to that very question. And not to mention, of course, Iran's foreign policy. But I'm glad that you veered away from that. Nadereh, over to you. A couple of minutes on this question. Any particular aspect of it you want to engage?
I think that the first and important thing would be to do an avar bardari or avar, because there is so much wrong with every aspect in the Iranian economy that we can't, sort of like just fix one part but not the other. Nicolas already mentioned, the doing business. And also he mentioned gender issues, women's issues. I mean, it's really sad that over the last 46 years, Iranian women have been so excluded from the economy when they do so well once they leave Iran. I mean, Iranian women are, on top of their professions everywhere else they go. But I have to mention that it was actually the National Front and all of these other, opposition groups that objected to the Shah giving rights, women's rights in 1963. So in other words, we're suffering from that thinking. But having said that, I think that as Hashim Pesaran, Hashim, I think you're online, wrote some time ago, it's like 80% of Iran's problems are domestic. Related to domestic policies, only 20% are related to or are caused by outsiders. So where to begin? It's a very difficult question. Certainly removing gender barriers would be a good place to start, because that could give an immediate boost. The IMF estimates that Iran's economy, Iran's GDP could increase by 40% if women were being, given the right to do, be economically active. And I want to say that it's 23 additional barriers. You mentioned 20, it's 23 additional barriers that Iranian women face. In addition to what men face in terms of, barriers to getting, getting out in the economy. Sorry, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. We do have quite a few varied questions. We have one specific question from Firuz Vakil on liquidity in the 1974 cabinet meeting. If maybe, Nicolas, you can just directly answer that briefly, if it's something you want to comment on.
Well, at that conference, I mean, the biggest brains, economic brains of the country were present there. The problem is that they were not listened to. I mean, you read the memoirs of these top educated people, and you see the frustration in them. And there's a very interesting book, by the way, recently by Rasul Reis Jafari, Furupashi, Ravayat Yek Furupashi, the story of a collapse, and it lists the specific recollections and problems that they identify. And it's fascinating to read it. And it's not that they didn't know what to do. All the recommendations were given, but they were not listened to. So that's all I can say.
And in fact, Firuz Vakil himself has written about that as well. Right. Now, Yasmin Saadat has quite a few questions, but one of them really touches on culture psychology, which again, Nicola touched on. I personally feel both Nicola and Nadereh have more in common than meets the eye. Where they diverge is their interpretation of the final years. I think Nicola's emphasis on the reversal of a rising trajectory of high expectations and lack of sustainability of those expectations in the latter years brought the Shah down and proved the Pahlavi era was not sustainable. And I think that is something that Yasmin Saadat also touches on. So let me summarize her question. You touched on culture, psychology of the nation, expectations, that is, which is interesting. Why do you think Iranians rejected the fast change and transformation of the country as most other authoritarian countries such as in Asia didn't? South Korea, for instance, in the 1970s, China in the 1980s, 1990s. In other words, Iran isn't and wasn't and will probably not be the only country which experienced rapid growth. You showed that Iran during the Shah's years grew at an average rate of 9 to 10%. This is exactly the story of China until its recent slowdown. So there's something you see in the culture and psychology of Iranians that is unique. Maybe just briefly reflect on that.
I wouldn't say it was the culture. I think clearly, as I mentioned in my talk, the strategy, while everyone was industrializing and trying to change, the strategies were very different. And that's what I pointed to. Iran's strategy was a capital-intensive strategy. Remember when I said to create one modern manufacturing job, it took 8 to 10 times the per capita income, because it was capital intensive. Whereas South Korea and China, they promoted industries where these countries had a comparative advantage, which was cheap labor. And they went for a strategy that created stable factory jobs that were relatively better paying, but they were stable. And they kept on growing and growing and growing because it was export oriented. And the Iran's was the contrary. There was a limitation there. And, you know, when these millions that came from the rural areas, the unintended consequences of the land reform, they ended up there, they didn't have jobs. They had construction jobs, which are very cyclical. And we saw as soon as Omuzagar clamped down and closed the spigot, all of these jobs disappeared. And these were people who were isolated in a sea, floating in an environment, and that's the link to the culture, where they were alien. When they would walk on the streets and see the mini-jupes running around and alcohol and all that stuff, and they came from a very traditional background. And these were the clashes, and they didn't have jobs. So what did they do? They went to the Hosseiniers, they went to the mosques, they went to the bazaars, and they were prime for being recruited by the radicals.
Nicolas, can I just take this opportunity to check with you? Are you aware of the so-called J-curve hypothesis?
Yes. In fact, I forgot, you know, I went through the thing and I forgot my second chart. Could you show the chart precisely? I was getting to that. Can you show the chart? Number two.
I've closed it now. If you don't mind, that'll have to wait another.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at that curve, it is a classic J-curve model. In other words, after a long period of growth, low inflation, and development of higher expectations, all of a sudden you have this drop. And I know this from some of my my friends who were in Iran at the time, my high school friends from Andishe, and they were suffering in those years because they had expected so much more, and they had planned their lifestyles around this thing, the gravy train continuing. And all of a sudden there was that decline. I mean, 40%, 20% decline in per capita, the real per capita GDP over 2 years is a massive shock when you have a 40% cumulative in the 2 years total 40% inflation. Your purchasing power goes down. So you see this notion of the Bell's famous article.
Great. Well, I'm glad you got a chance to clarify that. For those who need reminding, the J-curve hypothesis is a contribution by an American sociologist called James C. Davis. He basically believed what just Nicolas said, that social and political unrest is precipitated by brief periods of sharp decline in economic development, especially after a prolonged period of economic growth and improvement. That is when expectations are not met and you know, frustration sets in. So
that chart is in my article. So if people are interested, they can look into the in the article that is on the website.
Indeed. I can see questions are coming in fast. Ida has asked whether we can share the presentations, the PowerPoints on the IIEA website. So this is something for Kamyar and Mohammad Reza to take on board. I don't see why it's not possible. Right. Esfandiar Masumi reminds us, I think this is probably for Bianca, the Shah's attribution of his being saved from attempted assassination by the 12th Imam. So this is another aspect of his allusion to religiosity and being a good Muslim in his attempt to win the hearts and minds of the Muslim nation. Any reflections on that? You're muted, Bianca.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, yeah, the Shiite popular faith posed a great challenge to the modernism of the Pahlavi state. And this was particularly the case during the early Pahlavi period, during the Reza Shah period. So we have a great tension between the state ideal the social reality, and something that certainly also can be is valid for the Islamic Republic of Iran today. And while the Reza Shah period, in the Reza Shah period, we have an approach to popular belief or popular piety that was much more restrictive. In the later period, we have a relaxation that can definitely be observed. And perhaps this relaxation can be attributed to the Shah's personal piety, personal attitude, which you mentioned when he, with his explanation that he was saved from the attempted assassination from the 12th Imam. In any case, I think the modernist thinkers took a very skeptical view of popular beliefs, and something they naturally shared with the Shiite Orthodox clerics. So I think this tension was quite valid for the whole Pahlavi period, and maybe the Shah, with his personal attitude, contributed to a certain relaxation. But that is just a speculation now on this point.
Right. I can see that the Q&A section is actually being used as a chat, and questions and comments are being made, and some answers are also posted, which means the questions are then parked away as answered. So I believe, if you have received a written response from one of the speakers regarding your question, I can safely consider that, you're happy with that answer. Ali.pay asks, can we also consider the incentives for rent seeking more and more? It seems the clergy wanted a lion's share of oil revenues. They challenged modernization not because of modernity, but to increase their own economic interests. I'm not sure who this question is addressed to, but Nadereh, would you care to address that? Or?
Well, I think that if I can maybe just also follow on what Nicolas was saying. Again, what I wanted to present is that Iran had oil. There is nothing we can do about it. Iran had oil, and still today it is very oil dominated. 46 years later, it could have the opposition, which came in with the idea of whatever Mossaddeghist idea and everything, could have done something differently, and they haven't. So Iran is in a way trapped in being an oil economy, and it hasn't been able to escape that. Whereas, for instance, the Korea and Thailand and all of these other countries were not oil economies. So their starting point was very different. Having said that, I think that, yes, of course, Iran could have done more in terms of diversification, but we really didn't have people. We really didn't have the expertise. And that was a big... a very large constraint for Iran. Iranians had high expectations. They didn't want to do menial jobs. That's the case. This is why we were importing Filipino maids in a way. But having said that, again, I want to say that yes, I agree fully with everybody who has made a comment that the Shah should have listened in 74, 75 to his advisors. But I'm not so sure, and again, this is something that needs to be done, that even if he had followed their advice and kind of, toned down his spending, first of all, there was no model to follow at that point, no economic model to follow at that point. Even if he had kind of turned down his spending, we don't know how Iran would have fared differently in 1977 and 78 when the global economic crisis started. As I was showing, all the other countries, including Korea and Thailand and all the other countries, really suffered severely, and Iran could have also suffered severely. So we don't really know whether it was caused by the spending in 74, 75 or not caused by this. So, I mean, again, if there are economic reports of that particular impact, I would be very happy to look into. And also, you know, I mean, we are saying that the Shah didn't listen to the opposition, but who were the opposition? The Shah had reached out to the opposition several times, to the National Front several times in 1960, 1962. I mean, maybe the dates, I'm not exact, but around that time, and also another time later to form a government, and they had declined. The opposition in Iran was not interested in economic ideas. They were interested in pulling the Shah down. So therefore, there was no additional ideas coming from the opposition to help, or at least to calibrate the Shah. Yes, the Shah should have listened to his own advisors. I am fully in agreement on that front. But I'm not so sure that that would have saved the economic consequences later on because of global economic issues.
Hassan, could I chime in just very quickly?
Very quickly, because we've already run out of time, but quickly, please, yeah.
On the issue of the oil.
Actually, let me invite all of you to round up with 2 minutes each. So you have your 2 minutes, Nicolas.
Oh, should I go?
Yes, please. Yeah. Why not?
Yeah. I think I'll say this. You see, oil can be, as they said in Farsi, ne'mat, but it turned out to be a la'nat, whether it's during the Shah's time or during after Shah's time. It's how you use the proceeds from that oil. And if you look at the other countries, South Korea, I remember I was a young economist starting at the bank when the bank did its first major economic report on Korea. And I had the task of researching some things. And I found out that after the Korean War, the #1 export earner of Korea, of South Korea, was human hair. They had nothing to export. Korean women would grow hair long, straight. They would cut it, send it to Europe for wig manufacturing. From that earnings, they invested gradually into doing the wigs themselves, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it's how you use your income. Iran wasted its income. It's wasted it on billions of military equipment, on infrastructure that went nowhere because you just couldn't, ports were not there, but you had ships coming in. So it's how you use the money. I think that the oil, in that sense, going back to the nationalization period, the argument at the time was not to stop the oil, but to use the oil not for the budget, but for development purposes. And the Mossadegh's idea was to diversify the economy away from oil. And in fact, in the short term, as my paper suggests, and the data is there, they increased the non-oil exports while oil was zero.
Because the exchange rate was so low. I mean,
it doesn't
in a way, that's...
it doesn't matter. I mean, in fact, the exchange rate precisely was devalued in order to make the non-oil exports competitive, which we did not have during the Shah's time. That's the problem. So if you do that, you have to create incentives for people to export other things. And one of the tools we know as economists is in the exchange rate. So during the Mossadegh period, the exchange rate was devalued and it produced results. There's a very interesting paper by Cyrus Sosonpour and Patrick Clausen. I think I saw Patrick in the list. And they argued that the elasticities were very, very interesting to look at, and how they managed with very little income, zero income of oil, to balance the budget relatively.
Okay, sorry
But,
to.
I'll stop there.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I can see we started from the general and now we've
Right.
delved into very specific issues, which is a good sign. Let me invite Nadereh to also give her final thoughts.
Yeah.
2 minutes, round up.
I think that, again, in retrospect, we can say, they should have done this, they should have done that. But what I want to say is that, yes, definitely, as I was showing in the evolution of development thinking from, reconstruction, from the bricks and mortar to basic needs and whatever, there were, of course, evolutions in thinking. However, what I also want to say is that the Iranian people were much more impatient than even the Shah was in terms of advancing quickly to whatever they wanted to get ahead. I want to maybe make one more point on the Mossadegh side. The business sector during the Mossadegh, the bazaar, which was the very, very center of the economic activity, was in protest, they closed so many times that I can't even remember how many times they closed. So in other words, yes, maybe in the short run, they were able to, with the 83% devaluation, a yearly devaluation, export some non-oil exports, but I don't know whether it was possible in the long run. And also later on, as we can see during the time of the Shah, the Shah exported cars to, there are pictures or there are videos of it, exported cars to Soviet Union, shoes to somewhere. Iranian exports in the 1970s were much more diverse, and they were not just oil exports, they were export-oriented to the Persian Gulf area countries. So it was taking shape. It was slowly taking shape. It was not a black and white situation, and Iran was developing expertise to be able to manage that export industry as well.
Great, thank you very much.
By the way, thank you very much for these papers. I have read them. I see there are some suggestions. I have read them, but I wasn't convinced by the argument.
I came across the first one. I asked Mohammad Reza to add it to the chat. The Revolutions as Structural Breaks by Nuna Garupa and Rock Spruck. This is a recent paper. It's very relevant. In fact, Mohammad Reza and Kamyar, we might want to invite them to present in a future session, given the debate we have had today. We can agree to disagree on many things, but I think we can agree on one thing. We cannot deconstruct history. Whatever pluses and minuses we come up with, we are talking about history. We are now in 2025, and I want to give the floor to Bianca, invite her to reflect on what she thinks of economists arguing amongst themselves.
Well, I just, for me, it's highly interesting to see that, but it's also interesting to see what me as a cultural historian is, what I can contribute to this. And I think that by looking at aspects we did not pay very much attention at, as the aspect of religion in the politics of the Pahlavi state, we have another facet that enables us to gain a new perspective on this period. I think religion played an important role in both domestic and in foreign policy, and that's why we also had a research project on state Islam in Pahlavi, Iran, here in the University of Marburg. That project was with a view on domestic politics. And the pilgrimages to Mecca I talked today about, they add a foreign policy aspect, and that also includes religious policy. And I think that both the Shah and also the Islamic Republic of Iran's foreign policy, they was and are very pragmatic, a very pragmatic foreign policy. So in the foreign policy of the Pahlavi state, this Islam was seen as a useful tool in various ways, which I cannot now talk about. But in any case, important facets of history are lost if we focus only on the secular character of the Pahlavi state. And that was my contribution to this panel, which I very much enjoyed. Yeah.
Very much appreciated. Very wise words. We may be economists, but we are very much into interdisciplinary learning and dissemination of knowledge. This is reflected in IIEA's webinars. In fact, from time to time, we delve into wider topics. We do not take a very narrow approach to economics and economic topics, as reflected tonight. And in fact, the next session, the next event in June reflects this very much. We will have Professor Mehrdad Wahabi from Paris, who will be addressing Anfal and shared political capitalism in Iran. He published a book on this topic, and he will be actually a solo speaker, like a keynote speaker. So we will have plenty of opportunity to engage with his contribution on the role of religion in Iranian political economy. So let me take this opportunity to thank our panelists. I think you have really raised a lot of pertinent issues. This topic is not going to go away. We have passed 4.5 decades from the critical 1979 landmark development in Iran, but we are still engaged with the same topic. And I'm sure the passage of time will add to the depth and also the layers with which we would want to look back and try and understand, develop a deeper understanding of what happened and what we can learn from it going forward. So I would also like to thank all those who attended the webinar tonight. Apologies if your question was not picked on, because as I said, I noticed the Q&A also became rather like more a chat. So there was no point in repeating what had already been answered on a bilateral basis. I take that as a good sign that we had an opportunity to exchange our thoughts. Watch out for IIEA webinars, usually second Wednesday of each month. And the next one will be, as I mentioned, on 11 June. With that, thank you all very much and look forward to staying in touch. All the best.
Thank you, Hassan, for moderating this session. Thank you so much.
My honor and pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.